In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to scan color transparency or slide film using Vuescan software. I'm using a Nikon LS-8000 film scanner, but what I'm telling you here should work with most types of film scanners. Most of the basic settings should be about the same. I'm going to be using the Nikon scanner's color slide tray, the one that holds the mounted slides. And I put two slides on here so I can show you how to do batch scanning as well. So I'm going to go ahead and feed this in to the machine so we can do our pre-scans. It's going to take it a couple seconds to initialize itself. Okay. If you look in the input tab here, there's several different options we're going to have to go through. The professional option, you need to do film scanning because the other version of Vuescan won't scan negatives and slides. It's only for scanning prints with flatbed scanners. For the task, we're going to choose Scan to File. The source will be the name of the scanner you're using. If you've got more than one scanner connected, you'll have choices in here. I only have one scanner connected, so that's the one that's showing. Media type. This lets you choose what you're actually trying to scan, and you can see we have choices here. Image, slide film, color negative, black and white negative, and microfilm. It seems pretty self-explanatory that you would choose slide film, but actually with Vuescan you can either use slide film or image as your media type. On the older versions of Vuescan, there was a little bit of a difference in the appearance of the scans from choosing image or choosing slide film. The documentation for Vuescan claims that if you choose image, the scanner will try to scan so that the colors in the scan match what the slide actually looks like. And they say if you choose slide film, then the colors are going to try to match more like what the original scene looked like. Now, I'm not really sure how a scanner would know what the original scene looked like, but there was a difference. And some images I found looked better if I scanned using the image setting, and some worked better using the slide setting. That was for the earlier versions of Vuescan. The current version that I'm using now, which is version 9.5.73, that's the latest version as of the time that I'm making this video. I've done testing with this, and I've found that there's basically no difference at all using these two choices. It doesn't matter which one you choose. I'm going to use the image setting, and the next thing that we've got down here is batch scanning. Batch scanning is if you want to scan more than one picture at the same time. If you're only going to scan one slide, you would leave this turned off, and the frame number would be set at 1. You would want to put the slide in the very first spot on the slide holder, because the Nikon scanner slide holder holds 5 slides in a row from front to back. Now, if you're doing batch scanning, if you want to do more than one at once, you would choose either on, auto, or list. If you choose on, the scanner is going to try to scan all 5 spots since there's 5 spaces on the slide holder for the scanner. If you're using a different kind of scanner, it will scan however many slides can be put in at once. If you choose, I've never used the auto setting. I believe what that does is it detects how many slides are actually in the holder. For example, I've only put 2 of them in the holder this time. I think in that case it will only scan the actual slides that are there and it won't scan the blank spaces. If you choose list, then you can put in a list of the frame numbers that you want to do. And so you would list them frame number 1, -2, -3, whatever ones you want on there. The main utility of this is if you're scanning film that is not mounted in a slide mount and you're using one of the film holders that holds a strip of film, let's say the strip has 5 images on it and you want to scan the first one and the third one but not the second one, you would put 1-3 and it would only scan number 1 and number 3. I'm going to put 1-2 since we've got number 1 and number 2 in our film holder. Frame holder you leave at 1 for right now. Preview resolution, you want to set that at 667 dpi. The reason for using a lower setting is that it makes the pre-scans go a lot faster. You don't need a high resolution scan for the pre-scan because its only purpose is to give you an image on the screen for to set the cropping and to set the color settings. So we'll set that at 667 dpi. Now if you're using a different scanner than the one I'm using, the options for the actual number of dpi may be different. Just choose the lowest one. Scan resolution sets the scanner's resolution for the final scan. Now this you want to do the highest that your scanner is capable of. My scanner can do up to 4000 dpi, and that's what I'm going to choose. Now you can choose a lower setting and the scans will go a lot faster. The problem is you also get lower resolution, which means you can't make as large prints. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, I don't need a 4000 dpi scan. I'm only going to make a 5x7 print of this scan. Why do I need a higher resolution? With the scanner I've got, a 4000 dpi scan will do, I think something like a 12 by 18 scan at 300 dpi. And so you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to make a huge print like that. Why don't I just scan at a lower resolution, save some time, and make a file that's smaller on the disk? Well, the problem with doing that is that what's going to happen is eventually you're going to have a picture that you've scanned at a lower resolution, and then you're going to decide, I'd like to make a bigger print of that. And then you're going to have to redo the whole thing all over again. And it's not just a matter of redoing the scan at a higher resolution, but any retouching or any other work that you've done on the scan, if you've done any adjustments to contrast or color or dodging and burning in Photoshop or any retouching, you get to do all that all over again. And it's silly to have to go through all that work over again if you decide in the future you want a bigger scan. It's easier just to scan them with the biggest resolution right now, which really doesn't take that long with most scanners anyway. And the file sizes, yeah, they are bigger, but disk space is cheap now. It's really better to scan at the highest resolution. That way you can make smaller prints if you want, and if you decide to make large prints, you've got the resolution for it. So I'm going to choose 4000 dpi. Rotation would be used if you have a picture that needs to be rotated, because the scan's going to scan it in exactly as it was in the negative carrier. And the slide carrier on my Nikon scanner holds the slides horizontally. So if you have a vertical slide, it's going to be on its side in the original scan. So if you choose rotation, you can turn it so that it's upright. I'm going to leave these at none because both of the slides that I have in here are horizontal pictures, so they don't need to be rotated. Autofocus. Not all scanners can focus. Many cheaper scanners, like some of the Epson flatbeds, they have a fixed focus lens. If your scanner is capable of focusing its lens like the Nikon scanner I use, what it does is it will automatically focus on the details in the image. And you want that to do that, you want that to be set to always. Manual is something you really don't want to do, because with the manual focusing, it's not like manually focusing a camera where you're looking through the viewfinder and can see in real time the focus. You have to make adjustments, make another scan, and keep adjusting until you get it right, because you can't see in real time on your screen what the scanner's focus is going to be like until a scan's been made. So I never use that. The other choices are preview, which means it's going to autofocus on the preview only, and then it will use the same settings when it does the final scan. That sounds like it'd be okay, except that ViewScan actually lets you choose a different focus point if you want. If you've got a picture, for example, where the film isn't perfectly flat, you might choose to focus on the area that's the most important, so it will be sharp. And that can only happen if you have the autofocus set at always, where it scans, or it does autofocus at preview, and then after you do the preview, you can set the focus point, and then when you do the final scan, it will autofocus again using the new focus point. So we set that at always. Auto scan we set at none. You can have it where after you do the preview it automatically scans, but you don't want to do that because that defeats the purpose of doing the preview, where you can do your cropping and your color adjustments. So we just set that at none. Auto save I have it scan, and what that means is after the scanning completes, it will automatically save the file on your computer. Auto print I have set at none. Presumably you're not going to print these pictures directly out of ViewScan. You're probably going to want to open them in Photoshop and do some adjustments to the color and everything to make them perfect. Auto eject means when you quit ViewScan, it'll automatically pop the film carrier out of the scanner. If you're using a scanner that has a negative carrier that has to be inserted into it. Number of samples. Some scanners are capable of multisampling. What that means is that the scanner scans a line of pixels, and so it scans a line, then it moves the film carrier slightly, scans another line, moves it slightly, scans another line, and it keeps doing that until the entire image has been gone over. And normally it scans each line of detail one time. If you have it set with the numbers of samples set to a higher number, like 2 or 4 or 8, it will actually scan each line multiple times and then average the numbers it got from each scan. And the purpose of doing that is it reduces noise. Now, if you're scanning negatives, like a black and white negative or a color negative, I found that this really doesn't improve quality at all. It makes the scans take a lot longer because if you choose 2 samples, that doubles your scan time. You choose 4 samples, that quadruples your scan time. It is worth it sometimes with color slides. If you have a slide that's an underexposed one that you're trying to pull some detail out of underexposed areas, it really does reduce the amount of noise, the amount of graininess you see in those dark areas with color slides. For this tutorial, I'm going to leave it set at 1 so that the scans will go faster, but there are some scans where you're going to find that it may work better to do 2 or 4 times sampling. Now, I found that setting it any higher than that doesn't really improve quality any higher, so I wouldn't do any higher than 4 times. Fine mode. This is necessary on some scanners. The Nikon 8000 scanner that I use had a defect where, on occasion with some scans, you would see banding in the scan. Setting the fine mode eliminates that problem. It makes the scans take a little longer, but it's worth it because the scans will be better. This option may not be there for all scanners. There's some scanners that there is no such thing as a fine mode on them, so if your scanner doesn't support that, it won't show there. If you're using a Nikon 8000 scanner, I would strongly recommend using it. I've been told that the Nikon 9000 scanner, the one that replaced mine after it was discontinued, solved the problem that required the fine mode, and so it shouldn't be necessary with that scanner. If you do find you're getting banding, though, try that and that should eliminate it. Multi-exposure is something that Vuescan includes, mostly for scanners that don't support multi-sampling. It basically does something similar to that. Lock exposures, if you're doing more than one picture, where you want them all to be the same density level or the same exposure level. The significance of that is that Vuescan has an auto exposure function. When it scans the slide, it decides how much exposure to give the scanner. And if you have several pictures that you want to match each other, you would click the lock exposure and it would make sure that they all scan the same. Analog gain is something that is like a manual exposure thing. If you've got a picture that's scanned in too dark, you can increase this number and that will lighten the scan. It also gives you a bit of an opportunity to color correct since you can adjust the 3 primary colors separately. I would not recommend trying to color correct a picture this way because you can't see in real time what the colors are going to look like. You have to make the adjustments, make a scan, see if it works, keep redoing it until you get it right. That's a waste of time. It's easier just to take the color that comes from the scan and correct it in Photoshop later. I very, very rarely ever use analog gain. I have used it a few times on very dark slides that needed to be lightened, where the auto exposure didn't lighten them enough. But in that case, I've adjusted all 3 colors at the same time so that you get just a straight exposure increase without any change in color balance. If you go to the next tab, the crop tab, actually, before we go through the rest of these, let's go ahead and do our pre-scan, because the pre-scan has to be done before we can change a lot of the settings that are in the other tabs, the filter and the color and whatever. So I've got the set for the batch scan list to scan 1 and 2, so let's go ahead and hit the preview button. You can hear the kind of grinding sound it makes. That's the scanner doing its autofocusing. That's normal for the scanner. And you can see the scan starting to come in. Now, as the pre-scan's coming in, you can see the slide looks a little bit too dark. This is actually a picture of a white building. That's okay. This is because the pre-scan is done without the auto exposure being applied to it. Once the pre-scan is completed, then Vuescan will make its adjustments to exposure and we'll show you what it's actually going to look like. So it'll look good once the scan's finished. Now it's starting to do the second pre-scan, so it's autofocusing for that. Okay, now the pre-scans are done, and this is showing us the last pre-scan first. If you look over here, follow the cursor here, frame number has been changed to 2 because this is the second one. If I want to look at the first one, all I have to do is change that to 1 and then click in one of the other boxes and it will change to the first one, which you can see here now is perfectly, beautifully light like it should be. Nice white building. So now that we've got our pre-scans, we can go ahead and set our cropping. And it looks like my slide is a little bit crooked in the holder because you can see how it's not perfectly square with the crop lines. So I'm going to, if I were doing this as an actual scan I was going to use to make prints from, I would probably take it out of the scanner and make sure that the slide was in there correctly and redo the pre-scan. But for this demonstration, I'll go ahead and leave it as is and just set the cropping so that the black border doesn't show. You can see here in the right here that little flashing circle. That's the focus point. And if you grab it with your mouse, you can move it around, so you can tell it what you want to focus on. Usually what I try to do is find something in the picture that's got a lot of good detail that the scanner can focus on. If you put this on something that's, say, a flat, even-toned area with no detail in it, it really can't focus. So if I were to put it here, like on this flat red area of this chair, it's probably not going to give a very accurate focus. You want to choose an area that has detail in it. I'm going to go ahead and put it down here. Usually I like to try to keep it close to the center if I'm doing slides, because mounted slides a lot of times are not perfectly flat, and so it's better just to keep it somewhere near the middle. But if you really don't have a good area with detail that it can focus on, then sometimes you're kind of forced to compromise on that. I'm going to set it down here on this grass because there's a lot of detail with the little fine blades of grass and leaves and stuff down here. Now we need to do the same thing with frame number 2, so let's go ahead and change this to number 2. And the focus point for this one, I'm going to set it here on the tree because you got a lot of detail in the bark. The cropping actually looks pretty good on this, so I'll leave that as is. Okay, now that we've got the pre-scans done, let's look at the crop tab. I just leave it alone. I don't change any of the stuff that's on here. I leave it at the defaults. The filter tab has some choices that you might want to use. Infrared clean. This is a system that some scanners support. Not all of them do, but most of the Nikon scanners do. I think there's a couple Epson flatbeds now that have it, and I think Minolta and Canon's film scanners did as well. Infrared cleaning basically is a way of the scanner taking away any dust and scratches that are on the picture, on the film. Now you want to try to take good care of your slides and your negatives. You want to make sure that they're not, that you don't scratch them, that they don't get any dust on them. You want to keep them clean and be careful with them. But things happen. Sometimes a negative gets a scratch on it. Sometimes there's dust that's embedded in it that you can't get cleaned off. This helps you to fix that, because trying to retouch those kinds of things off in Photoshop can be difficult. Dust is usually easy as long as there's not too much of it, but if you've got a lot of dust on the picture, that can really take a lot of your time. Scratches are a lot harder to get rid of without messing up image detail, so if the scanner can do it for you, you might as well let it do it. Now you've got choices on the infrared clean. None means it's turned off, so dust and scratches on the picture, they'll show up. Then you have choices of light, medium, or heavy. The medium and heavy settings work better if you have really severe damage to the negative, but I've also found that they reduce fine detail resolution slightly. So I do not use those unless they're absolutely needed. The light setting does a pretty good job with most dust and light scratches, but it doesn't seem to affect image detail any, and so almost all the time when I scan slides, I almost always leave this turned on. Now there are some exceptions. There's some types of film that this doesn't work for. Kodachrome film cannot be used with infrared cleaning, and that's the reason for that is that the infrared light that the scanner shines through the film to detect the dust and scratches, the dyes used in Kodachrome block infrared light, and so the scanner thinks that the entire thing is nothing but a giant dust spot, and it doesn't know what to do with it. Black and white film is the same way. Traditional black and white films, the ones that use silver in the image, also cannot be scanned with the infrared cleaning. The infrared cleaning works for any E6 films. It also works for C41 process color films, and also for the C41 process black and white films, but not Kodachrome and not traditional black and white films. The films I'm scanning here are both E6 films. They're both Kodak Ektachrome, I believe, if I remember right. So we're going to go ahead and leave the infrared clean set on light. The restore colors and restore fading, these are for if you have an old image that's faded. The restored colors tends to fix problems where the fading has caused a color balance shift. The restore fading fixes contrast if the contrast is lower because of fading. Sometimes you need to use one, sometimes both if you have an old faded image. These pictures aren't faded, so I'm not going to use those. Grain reduction. I don't use this because it reduces fine image detail. And the thing is, we're shooting film here. Film has grain. That's the way it is. If you don't like grain, you can shoot with a digital camera. But if you're shooting film, then there's going to be some grain. That's something you just pretty much have to accept. I haven't found any kind of grain reduction system for film that works well without destroying image detail. And I've tried the grain reduction that the scanner software uses. I've tried noise reduction software used for digital images, which some people use for film scans also. It just doesn't work very well in my opinion. So we're not going to use this. Sharpening. This lets you use unsharp masking or sharpening. I don't use this in Vuescan either. The reason is that the sharpening system that's built into Vuescan is rather primitive compared to what you would find in Photoshop or Lightroom or other image editing software. And so I prefer to do my sharpening using Photoshop instead. So I leave that off as well. Our next tab is the color tab. Now, you see here, color balance, there's some choices on here. Color balance of none means that the scanner does no corrections for contrast and color. And if we select that, you get a scan that's real low in contrast and usually kind of dark looking. This is a good setting to use if you have an image that has extremely high contrast where the other settings might give you blown out highlights or blocked up shadows. Sometimes using the none setting will give you an image that captures all that detail, and then you can work on it in Photoshop later and try to massage the tonality you want out of it without losing detail in the lights and darks. That's not the case with this picture though, so we're going to use one of the other settings. In my experience, the manual, neutral, and white balance settings give more or less the same results. You can try them with your images and see what you like better. Here's with the white balance setting. The neutral setting looks like it was a little bit less warm for this one, so try the different ones and see what you like. You can see it right on the screen what it's going to look like. There's also settings here for tungsten and fluorescent light, which are to correct for the color balance issues you have with using artificial light, and those sometimes work well for that if you've got a picture you've shot under tungsten light or fluorescent light using a daylight balance film. I'm going to go ahead and use the neutral setting. Black point and white point. These I always set at 0. That reduces the contrast of the image slightly, but it also eliminates the possibility. I found a lot of times using the default setting where the white point is set at 1 can sometimes cause very light highlight detail to be lost. Setting it to 0 makes the image a little bit lower in contrast, and that's fine. The purpose of the settings in the scan software are not to get a perfect scan, is to get a scan that has all the image detail that's in the negative captured in that file so that you can work on it in your image editing software to get the actual final image you want out of it. It's very difficult to get a perfect picture out of scan software. It's better to try to do that in Photoshop and have the scanner set up to give you an image that's a little bit low in contrast but captures all the detail from the very lightest to the very darkest areas. So we're going to leave these both at 0. I'll go ahead and show you here what happens if you set them at a higher setting. We'll set this at 4. And you can see how it lightens up the highlights quite a bit. And some of these areas look like they may be getting kind of close to getting blocked out. And you can even see that if you go down here where it says color at the bottom. The color is reading 255, 255, 255 in this area of white sky. That means it's totally blown out because 255 is the highest color available in a digital image. That means pure white. You don't want that to be pure white because that means there's no tone and no detail in it. So let's set this back to 0. Where I wanted to put it, and try this area again. Now we're seeing the colors of 220, 224, 232, which is a white area, but not so light that it has no tone left in it. Now the curve settings here, curve low and curve high. You're probably familiar with curves in Photoshop where you see the curve graph and you can actually grab the line and move it up and down to change the contrast. Vuescan unfortunately doesn't have it set up that easily. they have where you put in numbers for the where you want the high and low tones of the curve to be set. It's very unintuitive, and I found very difficult to make it work well. I prefer the visual system in Photoshop where I can actually move the curve with the mouse and watch the changes in real time. So I always leave these at their default settings. I don't mess with them. Most of the time it gives you a pretty decent scan, and if it's a little bit off, I can fix it in Photoshop later. Brightness, red, blue, and green. Well, overall brightness lets you lighten and darken the image without affecting the color. The red, blue, and green brightness lets you do color corrections. Most of the time I leave these alone as well. This is work that's much better done in Photoshop. Scanner color space, I leave at default. The only time you would want to change this is if you've got a custom profile you've made from your scanner, which is something that's beyond the scope of this tutorial now. So if you've never done that or you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. Just leave the scanner's color space set at default. Printer's color space, it doesn't really matter what that's set at because we're not going to print out a view scan anyway. Output color space. Now, this is telling the scanner what color space you want the final file to be in. You can choose several different choices here. You can have Adobe RGB. sRGB is one you've probably heard of. That's very popular for use on the web because most monitors have an sRGB color space. I usually choose Adobe RGB, and the reason is that the sRGB color space, even though it's a popular one, it doesn't have a very wide color gamut. And there's a lot of colors that a color slide can contain in which the scan can capture that will not show up in an sRGB image correctly. So I use the Adobe RGB color space. The monitor color space, you would set these settings in order for the image that you see in the previews on ViewScan to look perfect. It's not necessarily all that important because you're going to do your final changes in your image editor anyway, but if you want it to look accurate on the screen, you would set these. And I've chosen ICC profile, which then allows you to search on your computer by pushing this button for the actual profile for your monitor. And this is something you would do if your monitor has been calibrated. And it should be calibrated too. If you've never calibrated your monitor, that's something that I would strongly suggest you buy the equipment to do that and learn how to do it. Because if your monitor is not calibrated, whatever work you do on a picture in Photoshop, it's probably not going to match what comes out on your printer because the monitor may be too bright or the color may be off. And so if you're doing digital imaging work of any kind, whether it's scanning film or working with a digital camera, you need your monitor to be calibrated so that it will match what your printer produces for you. The output tab. The default folder lets you choose where on your computer you want the scans to be saved. Printed size, you choose, I choose scan size because I don't want it to scan this to a specific print size. I just wanted to scan the negative at its original size of 4000 dpi. And then I can change the size later when I decide to make prints. When I go into Photoshop, if I decide if I want to make a 4x5 of it or 8x10 or whatever, I can change the size then. Magnification should be set at 100%. Auto file name, leave that on. Here you can choose whether you want a TIFF file or a JPEG file. I don't scan to JPEGs. The reason is that a JPEG file throws away some detail in order to give a compressed file, in order to make the file smaller. We're not concerned about file size here, we're concerned about quality. So you should be using a TIFF file. The TIFF file type should be 48-bit RGB. When you open this in Photoshop, it will open as a 16-bit file in Photoshop rather than an 8-bit file. The reason we're doing a 16-bit file, which ViewScan is calling a 48-bit RGB, is that the difference between 16-bit and 48-bit is 16-bit means 16 bits per color channel. There's 3 color channels in a color image. There's a red, a blue, and a green color channel. 16 bits per channel, 16 times 3 equals 48. So ViewScan's calling it 48-bit RGB. Photoshop's calling it 16 bits per channel. It's the same thing. An 8-bit file in Photoshop would be a 24-bit file in ViewScan because 8 times 3 is 24. And then the grayscale ones are if you're scanning black and white stuff, but we're doing color, so we're going to choose 48-bit RGB. The reason for choosing the higher bit, the 48-bit instead of the 24-bit, is that the 48-bit files allow for a much greater amount of color correction and manipulation in Photoshop without losing image quality compared to using the smaller, lower bit files. They do make the file size bigger, but it's worth it. Compression, I'll leave it off. TIFF profile should be checked. That means it'll embed the color profile, the Adobe RGB color profile into the image, so you want that to be there. You can type a description for the picture if you want. You can put your copyright information like I've done here. You can type in a date if you wish. Now, you can set these settings differently for each picture. If you want to use one color setting for one of the pictures and another color setting for the other, you can do that. All you have to do is go back to the Input tab, choose the other frame number, and then go back to the Color tab, and we can choose actually a different color setting for the other image if I wish to. I'm going to go ahead and scan them both using the same settings anyway, so it doesn't matter. So once you've got both of the pictures adjusted and cropped and all the settings made the way you want, we just go down here to the Scan button and push that, and it should scan both of them, one after the other, and save both of them to our computer. And you can hear it's autofocusing again because I've chosen the autofocus to be set at always. That's going to take a couple minutes. You can see it's only at 4% on the first scan. We'll go ahead and skip ahead to the end when these are finished scanning, so you don't have to sit here and watch this very tedious process. Alright, our scans are done. I've opened them both in Photoshop here. We can take a look at them and see if they need any correction. Alright, here's our first one of the red chair. I think this needs a little bit more contrast. It seems like it's a little bit flat. So let's go ahead and do a curves adjustment. We're going to use a curves adjustment layer. If you're not sure about using layers or about how to use the curves adjustments, I have tutorials on my website on crawfordphotoschool.com for curves and for adjustment layers. If you look at our whites here, it looks like it's a little bit, to me it looks like it's a little bit too cool. I'm going to warm that up a little bit with another curves adjustment layer. Reduce the blue just slightly. This looks a little bit too green now that I've reduced the blue a bit, so let's take some of the green out a bit too. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe a little more. Don't want to go too far because we don't want our whites turning magenta. I think that's still a little bit too blue. Let's reduce this just a little bit more. Alright, I think that one looks pretty good. I think I'd save that the way it is. As I said before, the scans are not supposed to look perfect right out of the scanner. The purpose of the scan is just to get an image that will capture all the detail in the original slide. And then you can work on it in Photoshop to get the color and the contrast and everything fine-tuned to be exactly where you want it. If I were gonna do any more work to this, I would probably do some perspective correction, because you can see here how the building is not perfectly straight. It's kind of pointed outward a little bit because I was pointing the camera slightly downward at the subject. So those are all things that you can work on as well too. But the basic color correction I think looks pretty good the way it is. Let's look at our other picture. This is actually the same location as the picture of the chair, the old chicken coop. And it's a little bit too cool, I think, in color also, maybe a little bit too dark. So let's go ahead and let's correct the brightness first. Open up these shadows a little. We'll do another adjustment layer to fix the color. We can see our before and after here, how it's just warmed up to just a little bit. Not a huge difference, kind of subtle, but I think we need to reduce the green just slightly more. Yeah, and I think that looks pretty good. I think it's, well, maybe a little bit too magenta now. Let's adjust this up a little. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Yeah, I think I'd leave that the way it is. So that one now we've got looking pretty good too from our original scan. So that's it. That's the basics of how to get a good slide scan with Vuescan and how to do the final correction on it once you bring it into Photoshop. If you go to crawfordphotoschool.com or on my YouTube channel, you'll find I've also got a tutorial for black and white film scanning, also with Vuescan, and I've got tutorials for other digital imaging subjects like how to do the curves adjustments, how to do adjustment layers, how to do dodging and burning in Photoshop. So you may find those to be useful too once you get more heavily into scanning.